You probably think that hearing a sound and understanding it happen at, like, exactly the same time.
Right. Yeah, that's the standard assumption for sure.
Someone speaks, the sound waves hit your ears, and boom, the meaning is just instantly in your head. But today, we're going to completely challenge that assumption.
Because it's really not that simple.
No, it's not. For a massive portion of the population, there is this very real, very invisible gap between hearing a word and actually knowing what it means. So welcome to today's deep dive, where our mission is to explore that hidden gap.
It's a fascinating topic.
We're looking at a brand new essay by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks called The Distance Between Hearing and Understanding. And the context here is super unique. We're looking at a piece she literally just published today in June of 2026, where she's looking back at an essay she wrote 4 years ago in May of 2022.
Right, to see how her perspective on her own brain has, evolved over time.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Assuming communication happens just because words entered your ear canals is it's like assuming you have a fully functional dining room table just because IKEA dropped off a flat pack box on your front porch.
That is a great way to put it. Getting the box delivered to the porch, that's just hearing.
Right. That is just the arrival of the raw materials, but actually building the table. Finding that tiny hex wrench, deciphering the instruction manual, realizing you put a leg on backward and having to unscrew it.
It's a nightmare.
It is. But that is the actual work. And in the brain, that work is processing.
What's fascinating here is that Dr. Hoerricks is writing from a very specific vantage point. She is an ADHD adult.
Meaning she is both autistic and has ADHD.
Right. So she isn't just looking at medical textbooks. She's mapping those clinical frameworks onto her own lived reality. And she directly targets this fundamental societal assumption we have.
Which is what, exactly?
This idea that if a sound successfully enters a room and a person is physically present in that room, then communication has automatically occurred.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second. If a teacher is standing in a perfectly quiet classroom, or, a friend is sitting right next to you on a silent couch, hasn't communication officially happened?
Well, people assume it has.
Right, because the words are clear, there are no distractions. Why wouldn't the meaning just arrive right alongside the sound?
Because of what we call the myth of instantaneous meaning. For most people, that cognitive assembly line runs so quickly and so smoothly that they don't even realize it's running.
It just feels instantaneous.
Exactly. But let's look at the how and why of what the brain is actually doing, even in that perfectly quiet room. First, your brain has to physically locate the source of the sound and isolate it from ambient noise.
Even if it's just the hum of an air conditioner.
Yeah, even just that low hum requires work to filter out. Second, it has to perform what's called phonemic parsing.
Phonemic parsing. Okay, what is that?
Well, human speech is actually a continuous stream of sound, right? We don't naturally pause between words when we talk. So your brain has to artificially chop that continuous sound wave into individual word units.
Oh, wow. Like finding the spaces between words in a sentence that has no spaces.
Exactly that. Third, once it isolates a word, it has to run a semantic retrieval. It fetches the definition of that word from your long-term memory.
Okay, so it chops the word, fetches the definition.
And fourth, it has to hold all of those retrieved definitions in your short-term working memory buffer.
That sounds like a lot of plates to spin at once.
It is. And finally, the fifth step, it has to analyze the syntax. It figures out how the words relate to one another grammatically to build the overarching concept of the sentence. Only then does the actual meaning emerge.
So it really is a massive cognitive assembly line running under the hood.
And every single one of those stations requires metabolic energy. It requires active, heavy labor.
But for a neurotypical brain, this process is highly automated.
Right. But as Dr. Hoerricks points out, for neurodivergent brains, that automation isn't always there. The distance between the sound arriving and the meaning emerging is entirely perceptible.
Like it's not invisible to them.
No. Sometimes it's an enormous gulf. She summarizes this with a quote that really anchors the whole piece. She says, "Listening is access, processing is work."
Listening is access, processing is work. That really reframes everything. Access does not equal comprehension.
Not at all.
But if processing is this massive multi-stage assembly line you just described, where do the gears actually get stuck? Because it can't just be one single point of failure, right?
No, it's definitely not.
Yeah.
Dr. Hoerricks describes auditory processing not as one specific skill, but as a very fragile ecosystem.
An ecosystem.
Yeah, it relies on attention, working memory, language centers, and pacing, all cooperating perfectly. And when that ecosystem fractures, it usually happens in a few distinct ways.
Based on how the brain manages sensory input.
Exactly. The most common bottleneck happens right at the front door. It's separating the signal from the noise.
Okay, like trying to have a conversation in a really crowded restaurant.
Right. If you have a neurotypical brain, you walk into a loud restaurant, and your brain automatically engages a filtering mechanism.
It just tunes things out.
Yeah, it identifies the clattering dishes, the background music, the 20 other conversations as irrelevant data, and actively suppresses them. It literally turns the volume down of the room so you can focus on the person sitting across from you.
But for someone with ADHD...
For many ADHD individuals, that automatic filtering mechanism is highly porous. Or, in some cases, it just doesn't engage at all.
So everything comes in at 100% volume. The dishes, the music, the person's voice, they are all competing equally for your brain's attention.
Mechanically, yes. The brain's processing power gets completely depleted just trying to artificially manually turn down that background noise.
Oh man, so by the time the person across the table finishes their sentence...
The listener's brain is so exhausted from fighting the environment that there is literally no processing power left to actually decode the words. The voice just dissolves into the noise.
But what if the room is quiet? What if there is no background noise to fight and the signal comes through perfectly clear?
Well, that leads to a second type of breakdown, which happens much deeper in the assembly line. It's related to that working memory buffer we talked about earlier.
The spinning plates.
Right. Imagine the brain is trying to hold on to the first few words of a sentence while it waits for the end of the sentence to provide the context. If that working memory buffer is constrained, which is very common in ADHD, the sequence becomes unstable.
Meaning the words are there, but they start moving around.
Exactly. The brain is juggling the words, trying to build the sentence, but it drops a ball. A multi-step instruction suddenly reverses itself. Numbers swap places.
So they heard every single syllable perfectly.
Perfectly. But the relationships between the components simply cannot be maintained. It's like the instruction manual for your IKEA table printed the steps out of order.
Okay, that sounds incredibly disorienting. But there was another breakdown she mentioned in the essay that fascinated me, where the pieces don't get jumbled and the room isn't loud at all. It's an issue of speed.
Yes, what she calls delayed assembly. This is where the mechanics of the brain's routing system hit a latency issue.
Latency, like lag.
Yeah. The auditory cortex successfully registers the sound. The information is in the building, so to speak. But routing that raw data to the prefrontal cortex, or Wernicke's area.
Those are the parts of the brain that handle synthesis and comprehension, right?
Right. Routing it there hits a massive traffic jam.
This totally reminds me of a buffering video stream on a really bad internet connection.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right, like the data is actively downloading, your computer's internal fan is whirring, the processor's running super hot, but all you see on the screen is that spinning loading wheel.
Yeah.
The movie is coming, the machine is working incredibly hard, you just can't watch it yet.
That is exactly what is happening neurologically. The processing queue is backed up. So the conversation happens in real time. The person nods, maybe offers a generic response. Then the conversation ends.
And then what?
And then, maybe 2 hours later, when they are sitting in absolute silence and the brain finally has the bandwidth to clear that processing queue, the meaning finally clicks into place.
Wow. So the understanding wasn't absent, it was just under construction.
Precisely.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If your brain is constantly buffering just to process a basic conversation, how do the people around you react to that delay? Because they can't see the buffering wheel.
No, they can't.
They can't see the internal fan whirring. All they see is the blank screen.
And that disconnect creates a profound moral misinterpretation of invisible labor.
Moral misinterpretation, that's heavy.
It is. When a teacher or a boss or a friend sees that blank screen, when they see a missed instruction, or they are asked to repeat a sentence for the third time, they don't assume a complex neurological traffic jam.
They assume a character flaw.
Exactly. Because they cannot see the intense cognitive calculations happening beneath the surface, they look at the delay and conclude that the person is just lazy.
Or that they're not trying.
Or they simply don't care.
In the absolute worst cases, it's viewed as active opposition or defiance.
That is devastating. I want you, the listener, to really put yourself in that position for a second. Imagine spending years, maybe decades even, sitting in classrooms or corporate meetings, trying twice as hard as everyone else in the room just to keep up with the basic flow of spoken words.
It's exhausting just to think about.
You are sweating. You are using every ounce of energy you have to hold those pieces together. And the constant feedback you get from the world is, you're careless, you're not applying yourself, you don't respect my time.
Yeah.
It completely explains why so many neurodivergent people just withdraw from discussions entirely. It's not a lack of interest at all.
It's sheer exhaustion.
Right. It is the self-preservation of stepping away from an invisible battle you are constantly losing. And Dr. Hoerricks is very clear in her piece that this withdrawal is a completely predictable consequence. But the real tragedy is that the individual usually internalizes those moral judgments.
They start believing it themselves.
Exactly. Long before they ever get a diagnosis or, find the vocabulary to explain how their auditory processing works, they believe the world's feedback. They believe they have a personal, fundamental deficit.
They think they just aren't smart enough.
Right. But the issue was never effort, and it was certainly never intelligence. The issue was that spoken language was being forced through a neurological system that processes it on a different timeline, using a completely different pathway.
So if the cognitive burden of navigating a purely spoken environment is that heavy, how do we fix it? I mean, we can't just rewire the human brain to process audio faster.
No, we can't. But we can change how the information is delivered to the brain. In the essay, Dr. Hoerricks talks about a very specific universal dread she experiences at professional conferences.
Oh, the video example.
Yeah. A presenter dims the lights and says, "Let's watch this short video." And usually the audio quality in the room is terrible. The speaker in the video talks way too fast. There's some distracting music track playing underneath them.
And crucially, there are no captions on the screen.
None. She describes sitting in the dark, watching her comprehension just evaporate in real time.
It's basically the ultimate stress test for that signal-to-noise ratio we talked about earlier.
Precisely. And an observer looking at her in that dark room might assume she's having an attention problem. But she is actually paying agonizingly close attention.
It's just that sheer willpower cannot indefinitely compensate for a processing barrier.
Exactly. And this is why the concept of captions is so revolutionary. We typically think of captions strictly as an accommodation for the deaf and hard-of-hearing communities.
Right, as a replacement for hearing.
But an extraordinary number of autistic people, ADHDers, and even second language learners rely heavily on captions, despite having perfectly functional hearing.
Because it stops that spinning buffering wheel. But how does that actually work in the brain? Like, why does reading text fix an auditory processing issue?
It has to do with distributing the cognitive load. When you are listening to someone speak, you are forcing the brain to do all of that heavy lifting, the parsing, retrieving, assembling exclusively through the auditory pathway.
And if that pathway is prone to bottlenecks, it jams.
Right. But reading utilizes an entirely different neural circuit. It relies on the visual processing centers. So the moment captions appear on a screen, the brain can offload the sequence building and the word isolation tasks to the visual cortex.
Oh, wow. It's dual channel processing. You aren't just relying on the auditory assembly line anymore. You've opened up a second factory floor to help build the IKEA table.
Exactly. The information stabilizes.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stabilize because the person's hearing suddenly improved. It stabilizes because the cognitive labor was redistributed in a way that bypasses that auditory bottleneck.
That makes total sense.
And this leads to a massive paradigm shift in how Dr. Hoerricks views accommodations. She writes that we need to completely stop looking at captions, written instructions, or follow-up emails as crutches or special advantages.
Because they aren't shortcuts.
No, she calls them translation infrastructure.
Translation infrastructure. That is such a great phrase. It's like trying to navigate a complex, unfamiliar foreign city. If someone hands you a map, no one looks at you and says, "Wow, you're using a map. What a crutch. You must be terrible at navigating."
Right, nobody says that.
No. The map is just translating the physical layout of the city into a visual language you can quickly reference. It's the infrastructure that allows you to move freely.
That's a perfect parallel. Translation is not a remedy for a broken system. It is the necessary bridge between two different systems.
Like translating a book.
Exactly. Nobody looks at an English translation of a Japanese novel and concludes that the English reader has a reading deficit. The translation exists because meaning is trying to travel from one linguistic framework to another.
So a caption on a video is a translation.
Yes. A written meeting agenda is a translation. Even just giving someone an extra 5 seconds to respond to a question allowing time for that delayed assembly to finish is a form of translation. They all perform the exact same function. They ensure the meaning actually arrives.
But I want to look at how society traditionally handles this, because historically, society always demands that the individual adapt to the environment, not the other way around.
Unfortunately, yes.
The struggling student is told to listen better. The overwhelmed employee who misses verbal instructions is told to be more organized. If we view these things as translation infrastructure, aren't we shifting the responsibility? I mean, is it really realistic to ask the environment, the classroom, the office, the restaurant, to change instead of asking the person to try harder?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly the evolution in thinking that Dr. Hoerricks highlights from her 2026 perspective.
Looking back over the 4 years.
Right. Since she wrote the original piece, her understanding moved completely away from the traditional medical model of disability.
Which is the model that strictly looks at what is broken inside the individual that needs to be fixed.
Exactly. Instead, she moved toward a concept called the architecture of access. And interestingly, the modern clinical frameworks actually back this up.
Really, like the DSM.
Yes, the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists and clinicians use to categorize mental health and neurodevelopmental conditions. The modern understanding embedded within it acknowledges that disability doesn't exist purely in a vacuum inside a person's brain.
So where does it exist?
Disability emerges in the friction between an individual and their environment.
The friction. So the environment itself is the barrier.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Let's say you have an employee who consistently misses important verbal details during fast-paced brainstorming meetings. Under the old model, that employee is simply inattentive and needs to work on their focus. But if you change the architecture of access, if you provide a written agenda beforehand and, send a bulleted summary email afterward, that exact same inattentive employee suddenly demonstrates incredibly deep intelligence. They catch nuanced details. They solve complex problems.
Because you provided the translation infrastructure.
Yes.
It's like asking someone to prove they are a world-class driver, but you only give them a car with a broken steering wheel.
That's exactly what it is.
And when they inevitably crash the car, you stand there and say, wow, what a terrible driver. But if you fix the steering wheel, if you fix the infrastructure they are forced to use, suddenly they drive perfectly. The driving skill was always there. The environment was just preventing them from showing it.
Yes, the accommodation didn't create the intelligence or the ability. It just unblocked the pathway.
That is so powerful.
And this is why institutions, schools, corporations, even just families and friend groups, have to stop placing the entire burden of adaptation on the person experiencing the barrier.
The classroom can be modified.
The workplace communication style can be adjusted. When we shift our focus from questioning a person's underlying motivation to examining the access we are providing them, entirely different conversations become possible.
We stop asking, why isn't this person trying harder to listen?
Right. And we start asking what environmental conditions will allow this person to easily demonstrate what they already know.
So what does this all mean? Let's pull all these threads together, because the core takeaway here fundamentally changes how we view communication.
It really does.
Communication has to be a collaborative effort. It is not a one-way street where a speaker just throws words across a room and assumes their job is done. Whether you are leading a massive corporate strategy meeting, whether you are teaching a class of second graders, or you're just chatting with a friend in a noisy coffee shop, you have to remember the distance between hearing and understanding.
You really do.
Simply speaking words out loud does not guarantee that the meaning has successfully traveled from your brain to theirs.
It requires us to be much more intentional about how we share information. And honestly, much more forgiving when someone needs a different method to receive it.
Absolutely.
And looking at the broader implications, it leaves us with a critical question about the structures we've built, especially when we consider Dr. Hoerricks' concept of delayed assembly.
The buffering.
Right.
Yeah.
Our modern world is absolutely obsessed with speed. We glorify it. We conduct rapid-fire job interviews to see who can think on their feet.
We demand real-time brainstorming sessions where the loudest, fastest talker wins.
Yes. We expect instant, immediate emotional reactions to news and feedback. But if we structurally penalize people whose brilliant minds simply require a few hours of quiet processing for deep meaning to fully emerge,
if we mistakenly view their internal processing time as a lack of intelligence or a lack of care.
exactly. What world-changing ideas, what incredible innovations are we completely missing out on, simply because we refuse to wait for the translation to arrive?